Well, Peter, it's been a privilege for me to get to know you and hear your story on your journey from not knowing anything about God, not knowing Him at all, to actually being in the ministry. I had asked you to come join me and sit down and film, and so I'm excited about doing this. And I know that your story is going to resonate with many people. So why don't we just start from the beginning, and you just tell us who you are.
All right, so my name is Peter Ashton. I was actually born in England, on the very east coast of England, a fishing town called Lowestoft, which would be quite small at the time. It is on a very cold part of the North Sea. There I was born 1960 in March, so just coming up to my birthday now as we give this interview. And I was born into a family. I'm the youngest of 4 siblings, got 2 elder brothers and an elder sister. There was a gap between my sister and myself, which I found out much later in life, actually, that I wasn't an expected baby. And that would, of course, have affected my whole psychology all through life without knowing why. So this is exciting to be able to talk to you too, and to tell you what happened. My family were all atheists, and I was the first, and I'm still the only one who's come to faith in God at all. We'd all have thought that death would be the end, there'd be no life after death, and no explanation as to why the universe exists. This is how we were as a family growing up.
What about your grandparents and your great-grandparents?
Yeah, that's actually important. I only ever met one grandparent, one grandfather. All the others had died much time before. Out of that, they would have been Christians of some kind. In fact, my grandmother on my father's side was a very convinced believer as a Christian. And she'd been a nurse during the First World War. During the Battle of the Somme, my grandfather on my father's side was severely injured, lost a leg in the Battle of the Somme in France in the First World War. And as apparently happens in wartime, the soldier being cared for by a nurse will often fall in love with the nurse, and they'll get married, and that is what happened. So my grandfather then, of course, very injured, married a lady who was a wonderful lady, but who died young of cancer. And that I think is one of the main traumas in our family background, which would have affected my father. He, in fact, was going to be a Christian. I think my grandmother intended that he would one day train for the ministry. But at her early death, very traumatically, he lost his faith in God and in fact began then to read seriously about atheistic philosophies. And by age 12, he was reading Karl Marx in one of the main books by Marx, Capital.
It reminds me a little bit of C.S. Lewis's story from his book Surprised by Joy, when he lost his mother at such a young age.
Yeah,
and I think he states as well that he lost any kind of faith that he may have had in God at that point. So it sounds similar.
Yeah.
So your father began to read Karl Marx at 12 years old.
12 years old, yeah. On our bookcase at home, growing up as children, we noticed he got books about Lenin, books about Stalin, and books about the Red Army. This is how the Second World War for him was all from the viewpoint of the Red Army. Of course, there'd be very many brave soldiers, and a great deal is to be found there in the battle between Hitler's Germany and Stalinist Russia.
So that influenced your father tremendously, not only the personal experience of losing his mother, but then reading these men who were renowned atheists who were writing the books of the day, trying to convince people of atheism.
Yeah, for sure. And I only now do I get some kind of a grasp of how many people were searching for some kind of way out of the problems the world was in at that time around the Second World War and just after, and many would have been searching for a very strong ideology.
And what about your mother? Where did she, when did she become an atheist?
In her teenage years, she may have already been struggling earlier than teenage, but she actually quit going to church at that time. She got some very strong opinions, not only about God, but in particular against the Christian faith. When she later on tried to express me something about her own childhood, which you'd have thought would have been somewhat idyllic, growing up in a very nice area of countryside near the River Thames, way outside of London, where the water would have been perfect for swimming, picturesque sort of environment, but she could never tell me anything about her own childhood except for one memory, which was so terrible that I thought, oh, I don't want to go there. So she was very unhappy for some reason, and so for whatever, she didn't actually go into why she lost her faith, but I think there's just, again, a lot of brokenness and unhappiness in childhood.
Yeah. So at some point, you believe when she was a teenager, she lost her faith.
She quit
Christianity. Her parents raised her in church.
That's right. And yes.
Did she just stop going, or she just kind of in her mind?
I think she would have closed off before that, but as soon as she could, she would have stopped going to attend any church services. Yeah. She actually, while her own mother was still alive, I never knew my grandmother, while her mother was alive, she would follow her mother's will to have both of my elder brothers christened or baptized when they were infants. But after that, with the death of her mother, too, she stopped having to do that, and so was very happy not to have my sister or myself in any way brought to a church or have any kind of ceremony.
Wow. So when you were growing up, was there any question in your mind about, is there a God? Did the question come up in your family? Did you ask this to your parents at all?
I'm actually often looking back and trying to work out, why did I not have any kind of sympathetic questions towards Christian faith? I actually seem to be not just happy, but even proud and aggressively proud of being an atheist, and knowing that I was so from quite an early age. I was fairly good at school. I was successful in the classroom, and all the schools I attended, I was always one of the star pupils in the classroom. But this thing about atheism, I cannot explain why. Well, maybe I could work on it, but why I was so proud and really had an attitude towards people who believed in God from quite an early age.
Wow. So the school that you went to, did you have any kind of religious education classes to where you were exposed to any kind of Christian beliefs? Or
no, there would have been a certain amount of Christianity in the background in England still. That may not be true today, and so Christmas and Easter would have been celebrated, and in fact in our family we'd have a Christmas tree and Christmas gifts. We did have a very nice home from that point of view, very warm and very affectionate at the time of Christmas, but with no religious content.
Nothing about the birth of Jesus?
No, not at all. And the kind of education, Christianity was part of school education in the UK while I was attending school, but there were always ways around of introducing too much Christianity. Yeah. Though in my one high school that I was attending, the religious education should have included some readings from the Bible, but the teacher had no way of controlling the students in the classroom, and so we would just play games. I remember one occasion actually having a ball in the classroom and going to the back of the room and playing with the ball during the lesson. It came to the point where one of the teachers responsible for my education at that school called me aside about my examination results, and they gave me a pass mark. I'm not sure how for religious education, but when he asked me why all my grades are so low, I simply said, well, I don't believe in God, sir. And I was able to express that when I was 12, 13 years of age.
Do you think that you can remember a time when you heard of the death and resurrection of Christ and that salvation was...
No.
that So you had not heard the gospel that you can remember.
No.
During that time. That's interesting.
Mm.
So moving on into your kind of, as you were growing up, then you were convinced of atheism more strongly, I'm guessing, as you moved into university. And so how did that come about?
So for me, somehow or other, it got into my mind that being intelligent and being an atheist more or less were the same thing. And I also found that in arguing against people's belief in God, I didn't know about what they might say as a Christian, but I thought, well, as they're a Christian, they believe in God. So my arguments against the existence of God, I never found anybody who really fought back in any way convincingly or even stood their ground. They'd maybe become shy if I was too aggressive. And also I know it's quite possible, and I'm sure I was like that, it's possible to be so fixed in one's opinion and decided that you're going to win the argument that even if somebody had any argument at all to present, I would not have been able to hear clearly what they were saying.
Your heart was hard.
Yeah.
You didn't have spiritual eyes
that
to
would
see.
make
so
sense,
even
yeah.
if someone maybe had said something, you were just ready to throw up the shield and defend and throw away any kind of truth.
When I think of the kind of mind that I had growing up, I was interested in questions, in particular questions of origins, just in my own thoughts. I wonder where my thoughts come from. That was one of the questions you think about. And also, when I heard the scientific theories that there was a Big Bang at the origin of the universe, that for me was very exciting, because I thought, well, if it happened just by chance, then it could happen again just by chance. You know, why not? Yes. So I would imagine, you know, in conversation with a friend, I'd say, "Hey, what happens if another universe begins now here in the room while we're talking? What are we going to do?"
You get into the question of the multiverse, right? Like we see in many movies today.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I notice here you say most of anyone that you knew that called themselves a Christian in high school were an embarrassment, but you had a couple of people, teachers maybe, that stood out to you.
Yes.
Can you tell me about them?
Yeah. So one of them was actually an art teacher at school, and he just made it known to people without pushing his faith on people, but he just said that he'd had some kind of experience, which called a religious experience, so that he would say that he knew there was a God because he'd had this experience. And he was a very serious sort of man, and people respected him also because he was an art teacher and was quite good at painting, and so that drew a kind of attention towards him as being somebody who was, you know, a good man to be respected. He believed in God because he'd had some kind of experience. Also, we had a new teacher for religion came to that school, and although he didn't actually teach Christianity during his religion classes, they're more discussion groups on topics, that he also said that he had had a religious experience, but again, without explaining what it was. And that also was helpful to me, because these are people that behaved in a way that I could say, this is a person I respect, and he never raised any arguments that I could fight against, and was just sitting there believing that there was a God because he'd had this experience. That was helpful to me.
So that stood out to you.
Yeah, it did. Both of those at the same school, and I suppose it was towards finishing high school there.
So then after high school, you went on to university. And what did you study in university?
Yeah, I went on to study biology. During high school years in England at that time, we had to choose whether we're going to be a science degree later or if we're going to go into arts degrees. And those who chose science would study really just science subjects at advanced level for university entrance. So I was already focused on biology with some chemistry, did a little background, physics and maths, then went up to university having got a good entrance to a good university, to study biology further. They called that natural sciences, but it was mainly biology that interested me, and I love nature, to be honest. I actually love nature and was looking forward to leading the rest of my life as a biologist, with plenty of contact with the countryside and travel and places where there were things growing and things moving that would interest me.
So as a young atheist interested in biology, did you have a strong interest in Charles Darwin and his writings, the origin of the species, and all of these things that he was, theories that he was putting forth?
That's curious, because that would be a yes and no answer. And this is fascinating. I believe now, from what I know from the United States, you've got a different politicization of Darwin, very strongly so, with legal strings attached to what people teach in schools. Whereas in the UK, in our textbooks, we were taught Darwin, but we never actually read his own texts. Okay. But we were taught about Darwin, and this was just assumed that this would be true. Although I had a cousin just a few years older than me, and he went through his first degree in science and went on to study for his doctorate at Cambridge University in science. And when he spoke to me as I was finishing my high school science, he said, don't believe everything you have in your textbooks at high school, because the real professors working in the field don't believe Charles Darwin, he said. So they don't believe Charles Darwin. He said, because actually the evidence doesn't work for Darwin's theories.
Yeah.
They said that things go in big jumps. They don't go by gradual stages. In the records and what we find actually for those measuring the data, he said that there's a new theory which they're saying is called big jump theory. And also introduced me to an idea which kind of was interesting. He said that he'd got some professors at university in Cambridge who believed in something which he called design. I'm not sure if he used intelligent design or not, but they actually were saying that there was design, that you could see things when you looked at nature that showed evidence that they were designed. And this is, it's true, it happens to be true, but that then means that I was troubled that there could be very intelligent people who disagreed with me.
Yeah.
And that was a challenge.
So you looked at Christians or any person of religion as someone who not intelligent.
Was not intelligent.
You just believe it because you were told you were born in a family who believed this, or you're ignorant.
That's
you
right.
Just haven't
That's right.
studied well enough.
Mm-hmm. And when we actually learned about evolution in high school, there were one or two textbook ideas, but it was even clear there, even from the teacher's point of view, that they didn't have a great deal there to teach the students to prove that Darwin's theory was correct. One example that they would have would be if there'd be an area where there was a lot of sunlight and then a dark wooded area close to one another, you might have a species of moth in which there was a natural variation of wing color, that the wing colors of those moths which were lighter, they would survive in an area where there was more sunshine, whereas they would get eaten less often by predators. Whereas those which had a darker wing color would survive better in the forest environment. And she said this variation then over time would lend itself to Darwin's theory that eventually they would become separated from one another and then eventually not be able to interbreed. That was given as an example. But of course it wasn't an example. It was a suggestion about what might happen if.
Yeah, you can't. Science is actually observing, right? How can you observe something that...
Yeah, and it hadn't actually happened yet.
Right.
They hadn't got any observation of it actually happening.
Instead of just looking at it as a designer maybe designed those moths to adapt to their environment. Mm-hmm. Maybe adaptation, not evolution. Mm-hmm. I wanted you to kind of go into more, once you were in university, you're studying biology, and where did you study at when you first started?
So I got a place at Cambridge University, which is a collegiate system. So I was in a college known as Selwyn College, fairly small environment, which was a very, very nice place to live. And of course, the science laboratories at Cambridge University had some famous names in them at the time and going back in time as well. Nice place to be. One or two students I made friends with turned out to be Christians, but again, in a conversation with one of them, I said, well, you believe in God? And he turned around and said, no, I don't believe in God. He says, I know there's a God. And that caught me unawares, quite a surprise. But yeah, I was not really in a good place to be studying at that age. I'd just 18 and a half years of age, going straight to a very different study environment, living away from home. And just before going to the university, my parents had separated, which led to a divorce. And that separation actually was very traumatic for me and was leading me into a kind of depression. And so the studies did not go well from the very moment I arrived at the university. And after just one semester, I actually decided on my own, got no advice from anybody, decided I would stop attending and dropped out.
Okay. So, should we talk about after you dropped out, what was next for you? Because I know some of the things that we've talked about, we'll get into Richard Dawkins and the selfish gene, but after you dropped out, what did you begin to do at that point? Did you start working? Or
immediately I was obliged to start working because there was money involved at the university, and having made my own decision to drop out from the university, there were debts to be paid off. So I actually hit reality from the point of view, well, from being a child taken care of through an education system and parents, all of a sudden having to face that actually there are financial considerations and you have to work. So I got just whatever job I could pick up just to earn some money. But I continued while doing that to be interested in biology, and increasingly I was fascinated by some questions again of origins, about the origin of life and the origin. In fact, one of the questions that was raised in studies was whether a virus is considered a living creature or not, and where did viruses come from? So that was one of the things I was interested to read about. And with a cousin who was going towards a career in biology, he mentioned that there'd been this book published a couple of years earlier by a chap called Richard Dawkin, who is now very famous, a militant atheist and very well known through his TV presentations and interviews and articles that he writes. But he became well known for a particular book that he wrote explaining Darwinism in more contemporary terms, following a lot more mathematical work in biology. This is called The Selfish Gene. And this has been translated into I don't know how many languages, and it's gone through so many editions that until today the book is quite well known. And he claims that his work in The Selfish Gene is now textbook stuff in most universities. The Selfish Gene. So he's taking Darwin. Should I say something now about that? Or
yeah, I would love it if you would kind of get into how you reading that book for yourself, what kind of impact that had on you. Did it lead you deeper into atheism, or did it have a different kind of effect on you?
Well, first of all, let it be said that Dawkins was a very intelligent man when he wrote the book. He still is, of course, but he was an intelligent man and knew what he was doing with his theories, and the new research into genetics and the mathematical modeling that he could do with that. So there's parts of the book which I would not have been able to understand, but with my own sense of pride, I would often take on projects which were beyond my level of education. But then reading the book and reading it with interest, because actually the style of the book is something that draws you in. It's an interesting book to read if you're in any way interested in theories of Darwinism and biology today. But he came to a particular page where he starts a section on, he doesn't say the word consciousness straight away. He's looking at the way things survive according to what a creature is able to do. And so the ability of a creature to make representations of its environment and to be able, from those representations, to make judgments and adaptations of behavior. This led on to the question actually saying, well, and as for us as human beings, how is it that we have this ability, which is toying with the word consciousness? How have we got this? Because from a Darwinist point of view, is that how would that be a survival benefit for the creature? But when he actually spoke about this theory about scientists not understanding how it came about, I had an experience myself, and it was just in an instant, without me trying to think through things terribly deeply, while I was looking at the page, something happened inside me, and I just saw it in a kind of way that I understood. It just became clear that consciousness, as he was describing the book, could not ever occur from what I believe the structure of the universe was, which was atoms colliding with one another and entering into different combinations and configurations. At no point would these elements of what we see around us ever become conscious. I just saw it, and it was so clear to me that it could never happen, that consciousness was a different kind of thing, and that it had to have its own kind of existence, which you might call a spiritual existence. It was different from the material universe. That hit me so hard, and I say I wasn't attempting to understand what I was reading. It just suddenly, while I was reading the page, it hit me so hard that with the book open, I put it down in my lap and was no longer an atheist. Just like that.
So processing through that thinking, even maybe you were not thinking through all of this at that time, but even now looking back, what are some other things that you can kind of talk through that really help someone who has been where you have been, where they are wrestling through these questions? Yes. Or maybe you were not wrestling at all with the question of, is there a God? But now at this point you are wrestling.
That's right.
And so you're thinking through some other aspects of evolution and everything that you had been taught, and now you're questioning evolution.
Very much so. This is perhaps difficult for some people to grasp if they grew up in a religious environment and accepted the possibility of God or spiritual things already growing up as a child. They might find it difficult to think themselves into how ignorant I was, and how this was the beginning of a real new stage in having to think about problems I'd never really thought through clearly before. Now, for me, I've continued to take an interest in these topics. So while looking back and how I was thinking through questions about evolution, that was at a time when I was interested in evolution without it necessarily having to be what I would come up with as the answer to how things developed as we see them today. I was open to variations in what evolution meant. But God, no. There was not to be any kind of a God there in the picture at all. So, but the fact that I was open to believe something other than Darwin's theory, that's important. That's important. So I was able then to look at what scientists actually do say. I mentioned how my cousin, who was going to be a professor one day, actually in the United States, as a biology professor in Oregon, he was a clever man, and he was good at biology. He was a good scientist, which means you spend a lot of time recording data and analyzing the data, and if you're honest, saying whether your data fits the theory that you've got or not. So he was a very learned man and very dedicated to study. And he already had told me that scientists did not believe Charles Darwin. Now that is a huge statement for him to have made to me. This is at the time when Dawkins was just publishing his book, The Selfish Gene, as a neo-Darwinist. The fact is there can be a difference between what is being taught, what is believed by people generally in society, and with the actual data that scientists get when they're researching the field. There can be a disconnect between what people believe to be the case because it's generally understood that this must be, and actually what the scientists themselves are finding when they do their experiments. So this is clear that the questions about Darwin became more and more serious, partly through examining more of the fossil record that's available around the world, partly through the biology of the cell. Now this is something I did know at that time at university, that microscopes and photographs of the cell were very difficult because the cell would usually be killed in the process, and so to actually know what was going on inside a living cell was difficult even then at that time. But the more that scientists discovered about what goes on inside a cell, when you get to the nanostructures of a cell, the more the problems come for Charles Darwin, because he didn't know. So in fact, yeah.
Didn't he actually say, if someone could show me more detailed ingenuity of the cell, then it would ruin all my theory.
Yeah,
he said something
like that. The quotation is there in the book. So if you get your own copy of The Origin of the Species by Charles Darwin, you'll find where he says, regarding his theory, which is that everything must go by small steps. Has to. That's his theory. And he said, if anybody could find any example where something could not have evolved by small steps, his theory would absolutely break down.
And the cell, it needs every single part to function, right? Because you have almost like an engine. It couldn't come slowly. They all had to come together, right?
Right. I think they might not use the word all, but there are examples. And don't forget, with all he needed was for somebody to bring him one example. His theory would fall down. The examples are multiple. Now, how do you might explain that? There's a biologist, a professor in the United States called Michael Behe, and he wrote a book published as Darwin's Black Box.
Yes.
And that's been some progress according to comments that we made. But basically, what he wrote in that book, he still holds to today, where he explains it very simply, that if you took a mousetrap which was made of 5 pieces and left the pieces, it would be impossible for that to work unless all 5 pieces were joined together correctly. You couldn't have the mousetrap built one piece added to another, because it wouldn't function at all. It wouldn't do anything until it was complete. Now that's his way of explaining, and that's the challenge, and many people have tried to throw his ideas out and have tried to say that he's simplistic, and this mousetrap idea, everybody can see that he's wrong, but actually nobody has yet demonstrated that he's wrong on his ideas about the mousetrap and the fact that the pieces have to all be there before it will work. When he goes into the details of, say, for instance, the flagellum of a bacteria and the engineering that's required there, that actually was taken to a court of law. And so this is a well-known case in which various people actually brought evidence to try and disprove Michael Behe. and actually brought in evidence which has been shown to have been incorrect. Now, I'm not sure if I would be so bold as to say that they were falsifying the evidence brought to a court of law. I would not do that. However, it is certainly known that what was brought against Behe and his mousetrap ideas, when he brought this flagellum of a bacteria, Behe actually comes out on top. He's still correct today. And so we've got examples where the more science knows, the less Darwin is able to explain it. Yeah. So it's actually an advance in science which is showing that Darwin was not correct with his theory. That's not to say that Darwin wasn't a great scientist, or that he was a great biologist and that he was very good and accurate at collecting data, just that his theory turns out not to answer the questions about how things change from one, or how new things emerge in the world around us. It's simply not correct.
And really thinking back, a lot of his study in the beginning there on that island was of birds.
That's
correct?
Right, finches.
And so he was seeing different types of birds, or maybe adaptations of birds, and so he's drawing conclusions
right.
of evolution from different types of birds, but not a change from a different type of species, from a bird to a dog, or completely different. You're talking about something totally different. Adaptation is different than evolution.
And the word evolution, unfortunately, has to be well agreed upon in its definition before any discussion on evolution takes place, because it can be used very loosely and imprecisely. But the question about the variations in beak size of a bird according to the food it's going to eat, according to its environment on one of the Galapagos Islands, these are things which can be observed and can be seen to be correct. That as birds are born with different beaks, if they find themselves able to eat food, and while their siblings are not, then of course there'd be a tendency for the ones with the better beaks to survive. But again, the point that's made by C.S. Lewis in one of his writings is that doesn't explain the origin of the new beak. It only explains why the other beaks led to the extinction of birds that had the wrong beak. So it explains why something might die. It doesn't explain why it was born. But the difficulties of Darwin have been now researched more in terms of what happens when you even get a variation within, say, dogs bred for different purposes or for whatever reason. The way the genetics works in the cases which have been studied and are known is that rather this being a development of complexity in the genetics, it happens to do with something getting broken in the genetics. So actually this would seem that rather than Darwin explaining evolution, something devolves and is getting broken and damaged and is less than it was before. This is hugely important. The other thing that's been done is also in mathematics. Say the time of the introduction of more mathematics to biology, well, there's certainly a lot more mathematics now required, and in particular to do with genetics and their ideas about how something might emerge. What has to happen genetically before you get something new, and how long does it take? And this is something for those who want to. They can find out that there isn't enough time for there to be random changes and random mutations for the changes that we observe to have actually come about. There's not enough time. The mathematics is devastating against those things today. So I wouldn't have known all about that when I was thinking about these questions, but for those who are interested, for sure, what seems to happen today is that a number of people simply accept that it must have happened. It must have happened like that, therefore it did. because it did happen. And so if it did happen, well, it happened. And so we just accept that it must have happened. And that's
so they're
basically...
living by faith.
They're living by faith. They're living by faith, really. That is, when they try to actually look at how it might have happened, they don't know.
Yeah.
They don't know.
Now, I'm curious, back to your cousin who presented to you that there's a lot of people who don't believe Charles Darwin. Was he speaking from a religious aspect at all, or was he an atheist?
He was an atheist, continued to be an atheist, that's right.
So,
that's right.
He was just presenting to you. Now, did he mention any kind of design at all?
He mentioned that there were professors that saw design, and that they were often coming under fire from other professors who didn't want people to talk about the possibility that there could be design. So
but they would not want to put a name to that design. They would not want to make a designer and say that it's God. Mm-hmm. But I know some have gone to, well, maybe the universe designed itself, or maybe they wouldn't even use the word design. But
these things have to be thought through very carefully, because if we the way the arguments go is that if you find something that appears to have been designed, what we know is that the designer is a mind of some kind.
Yeah.
So that's
and very intelligent.
So they would put together the word design with the word intelligent, and you've got intelligent design, because that's what we know. As human beings, we ourselves are designers because we have a mind.
Yeah.
Now, to go from there to the existence of God, it's now becoming possible. And in fact, people are beginning to say that now they're quite confident that they can say, well, what we mean by the designer in this case is what was in the Bible known as God, and what philosophers would have conceived of being a creator of the universe rather than just something that came out of the universe itself.
And so now you have, and it's not just now, but you have this belief that some people try to mix belief in God and evolution, that God is the cause of the Big Bang, if you want to speak it this way, or God is the cause of evolution, which I know is another big thing to challenge with people in, and they, of course, they try to re-explain the first couple of chapters of Genesis and say it's not a literal 7 or 6 day creation, and they try to mix all of these things and try to make the scripture say what it doesn't say, right? And say that's allegory, or
I think this is important too, that there's quite a lot of confusion being caused by people who are wanting at any cost to become acceptable to what is generally acceptable in society, and so they would want to say, well, I want to keep a belief in God as creator, but I don't want to go against what generally people think when they think of things having evolved, and that can be very complicated. Again, very, very often it will do damage to reading a text as you might find it in the Bible. It will also do damage eventually to science and scientific data as well, because if it's not true, it's not true.
Is there anything else you'd like to add to this, our talk here on losing your atheism?
Yeah. Well, first of all, to underline just how little I knew and how unable I was to even think about where to begin searching. And in fact, I was vulnerable to anything wanting to sell me its own product. So as it went into the next stage, where I was then befriended by people within the New Age movement, and against whom I have nothing to say. I don't want to say a word against people who genuinely believed what they believed and were genuinely wanting to be kind to me and good to me, and so I don't have anything to say against them, but just say that I wasn't looking for them, they found me, and in fact, by looking, I didn't find Christianity found me. And in that particular case, it gets very personal, because I would even say, well, it's not Christianity, it was Jesus Christ found me.
Amen.